my name is Lana and welcome to RAFFMA's Art Hour with Lana and Teresa. I'm just going to give a quick introduction of myself. My name is Lana. I'm a fourth year and I'm a Kines and Art double major.
Hi everyone, I'm the co-host. My name is Teresa. I am a second year and my major is health sciences with an emphasis in public health.
And today we have with us Bryan Kraemer. He's our Egyptologist. And Bryan, why don't you go ahead and briefly talk about what it is an Egyptologist is, and then we can go ahead and get started.
Yeah, so welcome everyone, and this is my first podcast live too, so if I'm as nervous as the hosts are, I'll take it all on me. So an Egyptologist, as Lana says, is a person who studies ancient Egypt. I would call them a brand of a cultural historian, and by that I mean that they do history with a focus on Egypt. And in doing that, the methodology that you learn as an Egyptologist focused on learning the language in all the phases of ancient Egypt, and the material culture of the history, the particularities of the chronology, the personalities in the ancient Egyptian history. And as a cultural historian, I would say that there is to that the added interest in not just what happened and when it happened, but what practices and traditions people had over the long period of ancient Egyptian history of at least 4,000 years.
Awesome. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Today we're going to talk about some misconceptions that people might have about ancient Egypt. So this should be interesting. And we're just going to go ahead and jump into our first one, which is, did Egyptians have help from the aliens?
Yeah, so thank you for getting this one out of the way early, because I think it'll save time for the rest of the art hour if I say from the get-go, as far as we know, no aliens had a presence in ancient Egypt, and by aliens, of course, I mean extraterrestrials. The ancient Egyptians had foreigners, if you want to use that word for alien, throughout the period of their time that interacted with their society. And this question comes up, I assume, because there's a lot of speculation out there on the internet especially, but since ancient Egypt was really studied for about 200 years about where the Egyptians came up with these fantastic things that they created, especially things like the pyramids. And some people have taken the history and proposed that humans could not have achieved what they achieved at that early date, and come up with all kinds of explanations, not just ancient aliens, but all kinds of fantastical speculations about extra physical forces, or all kinds of things that are not demonstrably provable from most of the evidence that exists, and are only really places you can go when you take the evidence that does exist and elaborate on it in your own mind. So no ancient aliens, as far as I know.
Awesome.
Thank you for sharing that with us. So our second misconception is, did Napoleon and his army actually destroy the nose of the Sphinx?
Yeah, that's a nice little anecdote that appears, especially if you go to Egypt and you see the Sphinx. Someone may say, by the way, Napoleon did that. It's again another kind of myth that gets retold in certain circles. And the origin of that, it's not true. The origin of that is that there is, in the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt, the battle that he won that conquered the country was called the Battle of the Pyramids, which itself is a misnomer because it didn't happen at the pyramids. It happened a little bit to the north of Cairo. So those two ideas in connection may have implicated his army for the loss of the nose of the Sphinx, but we know that it wasn't there even at the time that Napoleon entered Egypt. And in fact, there's an anecdote that it was removed by a fanatic cleric in the medieval period who did not like the continuing honor given to the Sphinx as some kind of talisman for the Nile flood. And if that's true, that latter true, which comes from an Arab geographer named Al-Makrizi, if that's true, then it actually falls in a pattern of destruction of monuments of the pharaonic past in Egypt, starting in the Byzantine period and into the medieval period. And it's interesting that the nose is the target, because that's actually the target of other destruction of statues. When you want to mutilate a statue to make it visible, not just a random act of damage, but one that clearly has been given a summary treatment of being hurt. In medieval Egypt, they would go for the eyes, and they would go for the nose, and they would disfigure the statues. And so it actually works really well with the Sphinx. If you cut its nose off, then it's disfigured. So it's probably a medieval damage.
Awesome. Because it's funny, because that's one that I actually thought was true for the longest time. Another one that I thought was true, which is our next one, is that the pyramids were built by the Hebrews or by the slaves.
Yeah, that idea is harder to track down the original author of it. It has to do a lot with the Book of Exodus and what people imagined the Hebrews were doing in Egypt when they were there. The Book of Exodus actually attributes their work to the city of Ramses, so the capital of Egypt in the Ramesside period, of which the archaeological site still exists, but there's no visible monuments. You can't go and see the temples that supposedly the Hebrews were working on, if you believe the Exodus account to start with. So what else is there to imagine they could have worked on when they were in the exile in Egypt? Well, there's the greatest monument, the only standing wonder of the world, the pyramids. There's a parallel myth that was current throughout medieval Europe, that the pyramids were actually grain silos, granaries, that Joseph built to deal with the 7 years of famine when he was a vizier in Egypt. And so those two ideas in parallel could have worked fairly well to lead to the natural kind of third idea that it was the Hebrews who worked on those. Interestingly, we do know that there was that labor by captives of war was employed in building pharaonic monuments, but the Hebrews are not necessarily a tradition that comes from there. It's the Egyptians don't have the equivalent word aparu written in lists of foreigners who are working on monuments. So that idea is an amalgamation of things that came out of real, like, second millennium BC events, and then came to be this more easy concentric story that was told in Exodus. So there's a lot more diversity to what may actually have really happened. The pyramids themselves were almost certainly built by people who were not necessarily slaves, but coerced to go there by their local leaders. The system of government in Egypt was, for most of its history, kind of hierarchical, so that when the pharaoh or his vizier decided to do something, he would send people into the country to round up the necessary resources to do it. And building the pyramids like this was a national project. It had to involve a lot of people every year. And so people from all over the country would almost certainly have gone there and participated for a period of time in which they were paid a good salary according to the standards of the day. That is to say, they got enough to eat and more than they needed just to survive. But they're not necessarily slaves. Although we don't really know the Egyptian idea of slave. In one textbook definition, it's a complicated category for any society, and especially in Egypt. Yeah.
Well, I thought you made some really good points. I also thought that misconception was completely true. Along with this next one, actually, I've had a bunch of ideas about this one. Was it true that King Tut was murdered by a blow to the head?
Yeah, that's an idea that is more modern than an ancient misconception, and is due primarily to the X-ray that was done of his mummy when it was first X-rayed. So as you know, the tomb of King Tut was discovered in 1922. Howard Carter was the excavator, and Howard Carter was painstaking in how he approached doing that excavation, especially even for the time of the standards of his day. He took it very slowly and he was very methodical. So it took them several years just to get into the king's burial chamber, and then to remove all of the layers of gilded shrines that had enclosed the body of the king, and the coffins on the interior, and the wrappings, and then the adornments added to the body of the king. The king was basically the nucleus of this huge complex of a tomb, and so he got down to that point, and at that point, they were removing the body, and they broke it a little bit, and because he's really solidified in a bunch of resin, and so in doing that, they messed up the composition of the corpse. And so later on, when they didn't have X-rays, of course, available in 1922 there, but in 1968, when they did X-ray the body, they noticed that in the X-ray of the head there were bits that had been dislodged. They looked like they'd been dislodged, and there was a dark matter in the back of the skull. And so this led to certain scholars proposing that those were signs of trauma, that someone had actually like smacked his head, the back of his head solidly enough that it caused a contusion of blood and dislodged bone, which would then be a pretty good sign of the cause of death. But in 2004, when they actually CAT scanned the mummies, CT scanned them in high definition, that didn't appear. It wasn't there anymore. It wasn't a real thing at that point. So the current idea of the cause of death for King Tut has to do more with one of his legs. I believe it's his left leg has an unhealed wound around the knee that may have led to sepsis in his blood, in which case he died. Perhaps that way he died of blood poisoning or trauma or something related to that injury. His body, by the way, was not in very good health for many reasons, and he had scoliosis. He had signs of suffering from malaria infection, not to mention kind of congenital issues. He had club feet, for example, a club foot. So he's a very good example of how you can idealize what the ancient Egyptians give us of the picture of their life in the past, much further than it would have been, because even the pharaohs suffered from pretty basic medical problems that nowadays would be much more treatable, and died from them, like Tut almost certainly did. Mm-hmm. Not because he was murdered necessarily. Although it makes for a good story. Once again, all of these myths make for a good story, and so they continue to be retold.
Right. Yeah, when I was putting together this list, and they're talking about, different causes of his death, I even saw one that said like it was like a hippo that like crushed his chest cavity. And I was like, that's one I've never heard of.
Yeah, I'm not sure how you would be able to forensically identify a hippo crushing you, as opposed to anything else of comparable size. Why not a crocodile? But there was, there's something to do in the literature to his ribs being missing, and so someone thought that was part of the process of his dying. Mummies are a fascinating story that they tell, or at least lead you up to the point of your imagination filling in the blanks to figure out how they died. And the other pharaohs have almost as much to say just in their corpses of what caused them to die. Of course, my favorite, and I think everyone else's, is the pharaoh Seqenenra-Tao, who's the second to last pharaoh of the 17th dynasty, the second intermediate period, in which his head is completely covered with wounds from axes from weapons of the period, which include axes and swords and spears. So he didn't meet a very pleasant end, for sure. But Tut almost certainly suffered too when he died.
Hmm.
Yeah, he suffered for his celebrity, I guess.
All right. Moving on to the next one. This is one I actually haven't heard of since I started working here and I did more research on Egypt. And I'm actually shocked that like people, like there's a lot of people who generally think this is true, and there's like so much like research on it and all this stuff. And it's that ancient Egyptians had electricity. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've only really heard that recently too. That's not something that I had come across for most of my kind of secondary interest in Egypt, and then my professional interest in it. And as a nice little aside, there's this one symbol in temples that people love to show me, which is an ancient Egyptian hieroglyph that is quite imitative of the Wi-Fi sign. You can look it up on the internet; it'll be there somewhere. So a lot of the ideas that have to do with electricity in ancient Egyptians may actually have to do with misinterpretations of Egyptian art like that. Another one that I came across is the idea that there's a light bulb image in that same temple at Dendera. It doesn't take much to make something look like a light bulb or a Wi-Fi sign. But the one that people, I think, convince themselves more seriously about is the idea that the ancient Egyptians couldn't have done what they did without the aid of electricity. And this goes along the lines of the thing I said at the beginning, that there are a lot of these ideas arise from the sense that the ancients couldn't have done what they did with the state that they were living in, or their technology was. And it's kind of dehumanizing to promote the idea of aliens or fantastical technological abilities when the efforts that the ancient Egyptians put into and the meticulousness and the resources that they brought to bear to do what they did, although miraculous, was doable. They were able to do it, and they did it in a way that made it look amazing, even despite all the challenges. So the thing that people like to say they couldn't have done without the aid of electricity is decorate and excavate the tombs that you have in, for example, the Valley of Kings, which are amazingly beautiful monuments. You can go in there, especially if there's no crowds around, and just be overawed by what it looks like and what the space is like. Even excavating them into the ground is quite an achievement. But the idea that they couldn't have had electricity there is because they're so beautifully preserved in many cases that the torches that they brought in would have destroyed the painting as they made it. That's not actually true. You can do a lot with very little light, especially for trained artists. And those tombs built into limestone like they are, the white walls will reflect a lot of light. Not just from something that you bring in, like a little lamp or a torch, but even just the sunlight emitting from the entrance to the tomb can illuminate a lot at the right times of day. And it is the desert, so the sun is pretty intense. So that idea is where comes out of the how could they have done this without our technology kind of trope. There's another idea that I think I mentioned in talking to you about this yesterday, that it comes out of this thing called the Baghdad Battery. And this by itself is pretty interesting, but it doesn't lead to the idea that they had electricity. There's a discovery made, I think it was purchased in Baghdad at some point, but it's a Sumerian, or it's a Babylonian, Hellenistic Babylonian thing. It's this artifact that consists of an amalgamation of vessels and then copper additions that, if you made the arrangement correctly and you added an acidic or alkaline substance to it, you could essentially make like a D-volt kind of battery. There would be a circuit between these things. That's not to say that we have outside proof that that is what that's for, or even should it have done that it is intended to charge an electrical current in a device that would be like a light bulb. Even if you have a battery but you haven't invented the light bulb, you're not going to get any light. So it's not leading completely to the to the point of saying there was ancient electricity. But you can find that on the internet too. So look up Baghdad Battery. It's a fascinating device, and that's one that the Mythbusters did something on, just to see if it's feasible as an electrical battery. Yeah.
That's super interesting stuff. I actually never heard that people thought that the ancient Egyptians had Wi-Fi, so or electricity. So
I think that's a very late myth, because most people are now, people who visit Egypt now and encounter this sign, they're like, oh my God, that's the Wi-Fi sign. But of course, 10 years ago, that wasn't something that anyone would notice.
So for our next one, I still kind of believe, because I've watched a lot of documentaries and it's kind of hard for me to not believe this, but what are your thoughts on Cleopatra being Egyptian and her actually being really, really beautiful?
Yeah, Cleopatra's a fun character to write fiction about, as Shakespeare would tell you. There's a lot of details in her life that can be filled in with a good story. One of them may be that she's Egyptian. The idea that she's Egyptian, I mean, that's a difficult thing to say. She's Egyptian versus what else she would be, because she was clearly born in Egypt. She lived most of her life in Egypt and became a queen of Egypt. So to say she's not Egyptian is kind of antithetical to start with. But did she speak Egyptian? Were her ancestors from Egypt as opposed to from the area of Macedon or Greece? That's the real question. And we don't really know what her parentage is 100%. We know that she was born of her father, Ptolemy XII, and her mother may have been Cleopatra the 5th or the 6th. We don't know 100% of that. It is her, but there's no real candidate for someone else. But that we don't know 100% leaves enough wiggle room to let the people who want to suspect that she is something else right around. And beyond that, she, according to Plutarch's biography of her, she had an amazing linguistic ability. She knew 7 languages, including ancient Egyptian. And she's the first king of ancient Egypt of the Ptolemaic dynasty, supposedly king or queen, who knew Egyptian and could speak it. So that leads to speculation about, well, maybe her mom was an Egyptian concubine or an Egyptian princess or something that we just don't know because we don't have the evidence for it. That's just speculation. The question of whether she was beautiful or not is entirely subjective, and it's entirely dependent on what you want to make of that. If you want to call her beautiful and say that she was a temptress for the Romans, that is an abuse of that category. And that was actually a label that was given for her by contemporary Roman enemies, such as Octavian, who really played her up as an exotic temptress for the person that she did live the last part of her life with Mark Antony. Otherwise, there is the actual imagery of her that was contemporary or even a little bit later in date, which includes portraiture, so statues or busts of Cleopatra, includes paintings of her, and includes images of her in coins. And those are quite diverse in what they show her to look like. If you look closely enough at coins of any period of time, most of the people don't look very good in them. They're very characteristic, they're cartoonish in their representation. So that's not really fair to say that she's the one that they happen to get right. Otherwise, her portraiture in marble, she looks fairly normal. I mean, she looks like a real person. She doesn't look like she is idealized exceptionally, such as the standards of other Greek sculptures like images of goddesses or images of mythical characters that might not look 100% like an individual person who was walking around at that point in time. But I would say she looks good. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Beyond that, from that point on, almost certainly she had an appeal because she was able to rock the Mediterranean world she was living in for 20 years by her sex appeal to Roman leaders. So they saw something in her. Caesar and Mark Antony certainly thought she was hot. Okay.
Awesome. So now we're going back to the pyramids for this one. I feel like most of these revolve around the pyramids, but it's ancient Egypt. We got to talk about the pyramids. And I think this kind of comes from like Indiana Jones, the really grand sense of adventure, and that is, were the pyramids booby trapped?
Yeah, the booby traps question. That's a good question. It's a fun one because, yeah, there are booby traps in some Egyptian tombs, and there are other things that might be interpreted as booby traps. Making an effective booby trap can be pretty easy, but it doesn't look like one. For example, there are effective booby traps in ancient Egyptian tombs of the 26th dynasty, private tombs, not the pyramids. And those consist essentially of a massive hole in the ground in a desert area where there's shifting windblown sand. What you're creating with that is essentially an endlessly filling hourglass, so that if anyone who wants to dig into that tomb, the sand will fall in and cover them up. And there are most of the 26th dynasty tombs, for example, the site at Saqqara, were unlooted because you can't get into them really easily without a significant amount of effort and engineering to remove the massive stones that cover the sarcophagus after you get past that endless sand pit. Other tombs are like that, and the one I'm thinking of is the tomb of Senusret III at Abydos, which I happened to be present at the second reopening of, and it took them 6 months of digging sand just to get down to the entrance, and another 3 years to dig the entire entrance out. And in terms of booby traps, it's not really sophisticated. You don't have sculptures shooting darts at you at that point, but it still works pretty well. So the pyramids are really effective if they were. The pyramids were really effective in the sense that they are massive blocks of stone that are hard to get into, and when they were initially sealed, they would have been hard to find the entrance to. But every one of them was broken into probably within a couple hundred years after they were sealed. Not all of them, though, and there's one exception. Of the 3 pyramids of Giza, well, there are a couple exceptions, but this one I like. Of the 3 pyramids of Giza, you have the Great Pyramid, you have the Pyramid of Khafre, and the Pyramid of Khafren. The Pyramid of Khafren actually had him inside of it, still, in the 18th century. The only one of the Old Kingdom tombs. But his mummy was not intact. It was really just a collection of bones that had been wrapped up again and stuck back in kind of a miniature version of a coffin. And what we interpret this as is his body was in there for about 2,000 years somehow. It was looted over that period of time, but the rest of them stayed there. And then in the 26th dynasty, so like 600 BC, the people of that time were very keen on restoring monuments and making Egypt look great again, that kind of idea. And so they re-monumentalized some monuments. They reconstructed some things. And so at that point, they may have reburied that king and put him in a new coffin. And interestingly, he was there until the 19th century, until about the 1880s, I think. And then he was taken out and he was being shipped back to England with his sarcophagus. And the ship sank. So now he's resting at peace at the bottom of the Bay of Biscay, off the coast of France. So of the 3 pyramids at Giza, the last one may have had the original occupant, but now it's completely lost thanks to modern interventions. Not much needed to be done to make a booby trap work effectively, but they overestimated the ability of the pyramids to hide the body of the king for long periods of time, because most of them were broken into pretty quickly. Yeah. They're also, in terms of booby traps, they're also magical booby traps, in the sense that there are curses inscribed on tombs. In some cases, that could lead you into the next question. I don't know, but they do exist. That doesn't mean that they're effective, though.
Right.
They didn't dissuade people. People still broke into tombs despite all the dangers that may have existed.
So it is funny that you mentioned curses, because for our last topic, we kind of want to talk about the curse of King Tut and the ideas surrounding that.
Yeah, so it's unfortunate. That's mostly a modern misconception because, as I said, there were ancient Egyptian curses in the sense that they promise bad things to happen to you if you break into something or if you violate a tomb, especially. But the curse of King Tut is a modern newspaper invention of the 20s. The ancient Egyptian curses that did exist were much more immediate in their effects. Like the one that I like, and I can't remember a lot of them. There's one that's really raunchy, which I can't tell you in public. But the one I like otherwise is if you break into this tomb, or if you enter this tomb with any impurities, which could involve things like having committed adultery or wearing wool on the wrong day, or eating pork on the wrong day, these kinds of things. If you enter my tomb with impurities, your neck will be snapped in half like a duck. Okay, so it's pretty immediate. Like I assume the idea is that once you leave the tomb with my stuff, it'll happen to you. With King Tut's tomb, obviously, thousands of people visited that tomb and came away totally safe after it was open, and still do nowadays. So there are a few notable personalities that did suffer a fate, and most important among them, probably the origin of this entire thing, was the death of Lord Carnarvon, the financier for the excavation of the tomb in 1923. So Lord Carnarvon paid for the expedition that found the tomb. He paid for the opening of the tomb, paid for its publication, and he was one of the first people to enter the tomb officially, although other people had gotten there sooner. And so when he died within a year of its opening, that really led people to think, oh, there's a good story here. And so there were in newspapers repeated quotations of a curse that had supposedly been found on the tomb about death coming on swift wings for whoever enters the tomb of the king. That's completely false. What didn't exist. It's not a real thing in the tomb. Carnarvon died in a weird way, a really weird way. Although, if you look at how people die in Egypt in the 1920s, it's not exceptional. He got a mosquito bite, apparently, although we don't actually know this is the case. He apparently got a mosquito bite and cut it while shaving, and then got blood sepsis, and that led to pneumonia, which then killed him off in Cairo. That sucks for him. But other people in Egypt died at that time of like the cholera, or pneumonia, or automobile accidents, all kinds of things where they're roaming around willing to take people out at a moment's notice. So that led to speculation from the newspapers, and then within about 10 years, a couple other people had died, but that's not a very effective curse, considering how many people had actually gone into the tomb. And then the man who actually discovered it, Howard Carter, died 17 years later of, I think it was an Hodgkin's disease, I can't remember. Anyway, it was a fairly routine kind of medical ailment. But that nevertheless led people to, play with the idea that somehow all of them had been touched by the curse of King Tut. So Yeah, nothing to it. It's a good story. The newspapers had a hand to play in it at this point, though. A lot of the other ones don't make it into the official newspapers. This was in the official newspapers at the Times. In the Times. Okay.
Awesome. So that's the last one we had time for. So now we're going to go ahead and switch to Q&A. So if anyone has any questions, go ahead and send it into the chat. We're going to go ahead and address it. While I do that, we do have a pre-submitted question. And I guess we kind of talked about this ahead of time, and this goes to anyone here. Did you ever believe in any of these misconceptions yourself?
So I believed in the curse of King Tut, and I believe in Egyptian curses because I remember being a little kid hearing about a new tomb being opened, and all of a sudden all these people start passing away from like really weird things. So I do believe that there are curses out there, especially when Bryan mentioned the ship sinking. First thing that pops into my head is like, oh, it's a curse. So I do believe in them.
Yeah, the ship sinking, unfortunately, then destroyed the body of the king who was on it. So not a very effective measure after that point. Yeah, I mean, again, it was the late 19th century, and so ship sinking was not an uncommon occurrence. When people were working in, still even nowadays working in Egypt comes with a lot of potential dangers that just get out of hand very quickly. And lots of people have had issues on site, who've gotten injured on site. I can name probably a couple dozen archaeologists who may or may not have got hurt on site or even died on site, just because you're out in the desert and you're doing strenuous activities, you're moving rocks around, there's animals who are dangerous, the traffic in Egypt is crazy, all kinds of things can go wrong. I actually think the weirdest, I didn't mention this, the weirdest circumstance of someone dying, not necessarily Lord Carnarvon's getting killed by a mosquito bite, but was the second in command of the excavation. That was Arthur Mace, died of arsenic poisoning. And that's weird. Arsenic poisoning sounds kind of creepy. It's like someone had something in for him. But he was the photographer, and so he dealt with chemicals all the time. So it's just an occupational hazard of dealing with the tools that you work with. I was once, actually, this is a weird thing, and we'll see down the line whether I got the curse somehow. I remember I was sleeping in an excavation house in Egypt for like 3 weeks, and then all of a sudden, someone needed to get into that room, and they said, "Can we move your bed? The X-ray equipment is underneath it. We need to get that out and work with it." So for the whole of a month, I was sleeping underneath an X-ray machine, or on top of an X-ray machine. I don't know what that did to me, but all kinds of stuff goes on that you don't think about it at the time, but it could hurt you if you wanted to.
Right. I personally thought the Napoleon one was true for the longest time, and it was only when I was doing research for this I was like, wait, what? They didn't use it as target practice? Because that's what I was told, like, all throughout.
The Sphinx, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, target practice, yeah, they attributed a cannon to knock the nose off. We don't have, all right, people have excavated the Sphinx a lot and have found pieces that are missing from its face. Most of the beard, or parts of the beard, have been found. They haven't found the nose. None of that nose is just lying on the ground underneath. It's not like he had a big sneeze and it's right there. It's gone. Someone took it away. Maybe as a souvenir, or likely, or to grind down into powder somehow and make it some magical device. But it's not there.
Yeah.
Also, remember, look at most ancient statues, and if they're broken, you'll notice that usually the nose is broken off or the ears are broken off, because those are the bits that are sticking out, and anything that hits them is gonna knock it off.
Right.
Fragile parts.
All right, so I have a submitted question right here from Kate. Her question is, did the Egyptians know about dinosaurs according to the Narmer palette?
Thank you, Kate, for giving me that very informed question. According to the Narmer palette, the Egyptians knew about long-necked animals, of which I hear they have a certain few cases in Africa of long-necked animals. That's what they show. They don't have any spots on the Narmer palette, though. So it could be an imagined animal, or it could be someone's description of some kind of animal like a giraffe, but didn't describe the spots, or a camel, or something. In that motif, it's being used specifically to frame an area for the grinding of makeup. So it actually has a purpose. These two animals are kind of neck and neck, and they're being held back by two people standing on their backs. So it could be room for an imagined depiction of something, although we have other images of this kind of animal, this cephalopood animal. In hieroglyphs, occasionally. It's probably just an imagined animal. The Egyptians may have heard of giraffes, well, they have an image of giraffe, or they may have heard of camels, which were running wild at that point, and just drawn their imagination of what a camel was. We don't know their name, though, as far as I know. Maybe we do somewhere in like the tombs in Beni Hassan, but I don't know its names. Not dinosaurs, obviously.
Right.
All right, awesome. Well, we just want to thank you for coming on for our first podcast and giving us all this information. I thought it was really interesting hearing about the facts. So we are going to close and end this session. I just want to remind everybody, our next podcast is October 22nd. It's our Halloween special. Super interesting, super fun. I recommend you guys come. We're going to have a RAFFMA employee named John. He's going to talk about our haunted mask and any other spooky stories that may be happening in the museum. So yeah, thank you everyone for coming.
Okay, you got room for one more question? I just saw another one pop.
Yeah, sure, we have room for one more.
Okay, yes, the Egyptians did have the word million, but it is equivalent to the word forever. So if you want to count past millions, it's going to be hard to find something in ancient Egypt that you would have enough of to count past a million. So millions and millions if you really want to get exorbitant in your amounts. So temples of millions of years are the terms that get used for the mortuary temples a lot. And it's just a way of saying more than you can possibly count. Millions and millions. Okay. Great.
Awesome. Well, that's all we have time for. So thank you for coming, and hope to see you guys next time.